I'd like to welcome you all to WCA's December 2024 second Saturday session. Today's program is Out and About the Walk-in Closet with our WCA Exhibitions Chair and Curator Sarah Ernst. Sarah is an artist, curator, and advocate of all things that help right the boat of life. She was born in Wyoming and currently works in Virginia. She received her bachelor's in studio art from the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 2010, and her master's in visual arts from Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2019. Sarah's curatorial work focuses on changing the aggregate of who expects themselves to be seen and celebrated in formal spaces. She's passionate about her work as a curator because it gives her the opportunity to choose projects that amplify the voices of those that have been underrepresented and undersourced. She has 15 years of experience in exhibitions, including a robust exhibition and programming record in museums. Sarah is a single mother of 2 adult children and a third who still happily lives at home, as well as many dogs and cats. She enjoys collecting 1972 Chevrolets, home renovation, paddleboarding, yoga, and any adventure she can take her dogs on. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Turn the program over to you.
I appreciate that. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Ernst, curator and artist here. And I am thrilled to be able to share with you this project that I did for the Fredericksburg Area Museum when I was a curator there at that institution. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Alrighty. So this exhibition is called Out and About the Walk-in Closet, and it is a 4,000-year history, global history of LGBTQ plus persons. But then also there is a 200-year history of that same history in where I live, which is in the shallow South in Virginia. I'm in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is about halfway between Richmond and DC. It's about an hour each way. And I feel like I like to be able to see you all while I'm talking about this to begin with.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me go back. There we go. So I'm just going to go over the exhibition. So the exhibition is called Out and About the Walk-in Closet because there was an article in doing my research. There was an article in a magazine in 1992 that referred to the population of Fredericksburg, Virginia, the gay lesbian population, as, quote, so large that the closet is a walk-in. And that is credited in a large part because of Fredericksburg's location between DC and Richmond. So people could travel to places where there were, gay bars, dance, see each other. And then when you came back to Fredericksburg, you sort of like, if you knew, you knew sort of thing. So let me now share my screen. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit about, let's see, about this exhibit. This exhibit was a community curated exhibit. It says on here that I actually had 70 members, but it was more like 100 people that came through the exhibit from the LGBTQ plus community locally that weighed in on the history and helped with this exhibit. And then there was also a steering committee of 7 people that were stakeholders from the community, such as the Pride Center, affirming churches such as the House, which is a campus ministry, trans support groups, etc., that helped guide this exhibition as well. So here is the first zone of the exhibition, where it starts with that introductory text, like, so large the closet is a walk-in. And in the first zone, we talk about that story in addition to the sort of intersection of race, class, and gender, because it's noted that here in Fredericksburg, there was, because of its location amongst all of these different military bases, there are lots of people that for years and years literally could not come out. And so there was sort of a hierarchy of, if you were queer, but the majority of people didn't know. If you weren't out, then there was sort of a strange hierarchy that was exposed there. But also with the whole thing with class and gender and race, that's something that we get into a little bit here. This is the opening night with the crowd there. So a bit on for the vernacular and exhibit wording. So the words that are used in this exhibition, such as queer, are words that, and also erasure, are words that at one point and to a certain generations might still be troubling, but they're words that have been reclaimed by this community. And so that's why we're using them in that context. So it was my intention that you wouldn't be able to get past this first section of the exhibition without, this is like the information section. So the first section just past the introductory text covers governing queer bodies, and it really is the non-playable game of being governed as a queer person. And it goes into everything from like marriage equality, lavender, one second. Milo, help. The lavender scare, bathroom bills now. And this is all presented it's a tight space, so it's not a great photo, but this is all presented within this shrine that during the curation of this exhibition, I referred to this space constantly as the weird Grecian shrine thing. And the reason that it was there is because what was in this room at the museum before I turned it over was a decorative arts exhibition, which is probably the furthest thing from anything that I think is interesting. And there was this shrine that was built here so that when George Washington's Bible that belonged to the Masons was exhibited, it could be exhibited in this shrine, similarly to what like the photos of George Washington was with it when he was living. And so I absolutely got tickled to be able to paint this shrine red and then have this be like the host of this topic of governing queer bodies. And then on the back of the shrine is projected a film that was an 8-minute film that was meant to be a larger piece that would be released at the halfway mark at the exhibition. And in back of what you see there is Shenandoah, the wonderful local drag queen Shenandoah, who we will get into a little bit later. So across from the shrine, we have, and here's another shot with from opening night. This is people watching the film. And Shenandoah actually is in the center of that shot. We'll talk more about her later, but it was my intention for people to not get past these first couple of zones without being able to say, and still, if they had read things, making sure that people wouldn't be able to argue that this was a construct or something new. So the wall behind the viewers here, and that's actually the filmmaker with the white hair on the right-hand side. The wall behind this, the viewers, is actually a 7-foot wide installation, which I have a better picture of at some point, of gender across time, culture, and in nature. And so one of my favorite parts of this wall is there's a little Hamlet robot that's reciting to be or not to be in binary code. And this installation really goes into sort of gender as a spectrum. One of my favorite things, and this is a point that the amazing designer Emily Keppel, who helped design this exhibition, something that they brought up was if Finding Nemo was a real thing, it wouldn't have existed because all clownfish are matriarchal. And if the mother clownfish dies, then the father clownfish just becomes the mother clownfish. And so some of it's playful, but it's very like science-based. So we're about to get to the timeline, and also this pertains to that installation that I just showed you, which I'll show again later. So this is history zoomed out and then kind of focused in. So like I said before, the walk-in closet exhibition is 4,000 years of global history. So it actually goes back to Hatshepsut in Egypt. And then we come into 19th and 20th century. So ancient history from the Iliad to Passion of the Cut Sleeve. So some of these ancient history examples, the first 18th Egyptian dynasty, 2000 BCE. This is a bust of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. And she was referred to, so she was a woman but she was referred to as a king. There wasn't a word for queen. And she actually, after she became queen or king, she started donning male clothing and she grew facial hair. So that's the first record of trans that I'm bringing up in this exhibition. Then we move to the Han Dynasty in 10 BCE. That is the Passion of the Cut Sleeve, which is a story about an emperor who was so in love with their partner that instead of waking them when they got out of bed, they cut the sleeve of their gown off so that they would still be at peace. And that was very common for emperors to have same-sex partners in addition to their wives. And they were actually people that would have had a lot of status because of their relationship to the emperor. Of course, then we get into a little bit closer history. Sappho, this is a bust of her from 570 BCE. Sappho, of course, is the poet, the lyrical poet from the Isle of Lesbos, which is where we get those words, both the word sapphic and the word lesbian. A little bit less ancient history. The Legend of Pope Joan. This is actually, I read a book on her years and years and years before doing this project. And she's fascinating because she doesn't really appear until the 1300s. But people believed in her. It was something that was actually, she was in the records of the Catholic Church. And her story is that she was a young woman that came in under the guise of being male to the papacy. And then she became pregnant. And the story then says either that she died in childbirth during a papal march or that she was stoned to death, depending on which version of it you're listening to. And this was believed to be a true story for years and years. And then later on, they said, actually, we think that maybe this is just something that somebody put in out of spite, into our records out of spite. Then we get to Joan of Arc, of course, who helped fight in the 100 Years' War, only to be burned at the stake for heresy. And much of that heresy was that she refused to don female clothing. And then we get into a little bit closer, Baron von Steuben, who is he was a Persian military officer, and he was recruited by George Washington to help modernize in that time Washington's army. And so in a large part of why America ended up being America is because of this work of Baron von Steuben. After he helps us win the Revolutionary War, Baron von Steuben ends up retiring to New York City with two men that he met while he was serving, and he adopts both of those men. That was a common practice before marriage to keep assets and also like records of people together. Instead of being married, you would adopt. Fun fact, I love this fact. In 1872, there was a book called Carmelia, which is a lesbian vampire story, and that's 30 years before Bram Stoker published Dracula. So the original Dracula story is lesbian. And there was a section in the exhibition, several sections where I provided books. Sometimes there were books that were about contemporary authors, but there was also historical books. And so I provided this book, and I just put a little piece of tape over the illustration where you could see her boobs. And said that was enough editing. You know, we're not here to edit things. Censorship down. All right, more recent history in the 1800s. So the first picture we have here is Amelia Robles Avila. So Amelia was born female to a family that has money. Lots of the stories in this exhibition will start with that, because that's one of the ways that people could be safe, you know, versus the people that sort of had to hide more. So he was born to a family that had money, and he was much more interested in things like guns and shooting and just sort of these machismo things than about interested in like the things that were typically women's roles. So he actually ended up joining the Mexican Revolution as a Zapatista, and he was a colonel. He was well respected, and he actually ended up being a decorated war hero. He met, and the military like recognized him as a man, and they gave him the accolades and they gave him a pension. And he was said to defend his masculinity very staunchly with his guns and his behavior. The second slide person that we have here is Wewa. So when the colonists came to America, there were 133 different second or third gender berdache is what the term for that, which is another word that could be problematic but is being reclaimed. 133 different tribes that had this, that recognized a third gender or more. And so Wewa was actually born on a Zuni reservation, and she would do both things. She would weave, she would do things that were customary for women, but she would also like work her land and those sorts of things. Wewa actually was brought by a person who was doing an ethnology report to Washington, D.C., and met with Grover Cleveland. And you can see pictures of her sitting weaving on the yard at the Smithsonian, teaching people about the Zuni ways.
Sarah, we don't
Yeah.
see the slideshow anymore.
Oh, you don't see it?
No,
What do you see? Do you see me?
I just see you. Does anyone else see her slideshow? Or did I?
How long has
I
it been that
see
you've
her.
seen it?
You see
I
it?
see it, yes.
Okay, maybe it's my settings.
I see it too.
Oh, now I see it. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
So while I have the floor, could you spell that word that you're using, the Weiwa, the word, I don't know what it is, that you use to say that it's a word that's being reclaimed, but it refers
That's
to,
actually berdache. So
Yeah.
it's BERDACHE.
B-E-R-D,
ACHE.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. 1 second. Milo. I have a German Shepherd that thinks that since I'm in this room that I should be outside playing with her. So I apologize for the little yips. Yeah, so Wewa and Oshtish, both these people on the right-hand side, were both berdache. Oshtish, I love this story. So Oshtish is the person on the right of the third picture. And her name literally means finds them and kills them. And she was from, actually where I'm from, it's part of the reason I love this story. She was from Montana. She was Crow. And she was given this name in the Battle of Rosebud by another fighter that was called Pretty Shield. And she was a fierce adversary, but also obviously presents as female. And this is her with her wife. And when the colonists came out and tried to sort of re-educate the people that were the berdache, they were saying, you know, we have to make these people wear male clothing. They would like, actually, for example, with Wewa, they took her and like 40 miles away and put her in this re-education facility. And she broke out, fought them, broke out, and then walked the 40 miles to go back home. But when people would come out and say, specifically of Oshtish, that they needed to make her wear male clothing, her whole community was like, we don't mess with her. Like, these are sacred. They believe the berdache were sacred people. And they actually believe that in some instances, if a man were to sleep with a berdache, that they would be able to receive some of their powers. And so it was common to sleep with them before you would go off in battle. But they were really looked at as sacred beings. A little bit closer history. This one's super sad. So there's this picture of Nazis burning books that I have seen for years without knowing actually the context of what it was. And in the late 1800s, there was a man that was in Berlin that had somebody come to him, and it was a man that was being forced to get married, and he shared his wish that he wasn't getting married to a woman with the doctor, and then killed himself. And the man was like just so shook that he opened this clinic and started doing these transgender surgeries. I think I might have another picture, maybe I don't. There are pictures that you can see of the people, because he would do these transgender surgeries and then he would have them working in his clinic while they were healing. So in the 1930s, when the Nazis were there, he left because he not only was he gay, but he was also Jewish. And so he was actually at a theater and he saw these images of the Nazis burning these books, and they had gone into his study, and they burned like literally hundreds of years of very, very specific information on early transgender surgeries that's been lost forever. And the quote that was in one of those books was, "If they will burn books, they will burn people," which is just, ugh. So a little bit closer history, we have 1969, we have the protesters and police crashing at Stonewall. That's in New York City. That was June of 1969. That's why June is Pride Month, for anybody who doesn't know. All right, so Fredericksburg is in the shallow South, like I said. Actually, today, I think actually today, there are probably people dressed as Confederates and Union soldiers walking around the downtown where I live, pretending to shoot each other because this is the anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, right? It was on the 11th. So it's a very politically loaded, like potentially loaded climate. But it's more like sort of a safe haven in the middle of all of this other stuff. So one of my favorite facts is that in 1863, there was a group of Confederate soldiers stationed here in Fredericksburg that threw a drag show featuring themselves. And you actually have first-person accounts, right? Like letters that you can read the accounts of these drag shows. The picture here is actually from Deadeye Drag. These are actually Union soldiers in the picture, but we have records of them performing drag just a little ways away from here in Brandywine, Virginia. Also, in 1864, there's records of Brandywine gander balls. So gander balls were the term used for when men would dress up as women. And they held one in Brandywine, which is just a ways from here. And it was said that, if you read the letters, that some of the townswomen went, but the men liked their comrades dressed as women better. And so the women ended up going home and they spent the night having this ball together. And some of the letters will read things like, some of them looked good enough to lay with, I know I laid with mine. Or James from Company 11 was the best dressed at this ball. Those sorts of things. So that all of those things fit in somewhere here with a lot of other history on this 4,000 year timeline. So the lower is 4,000 years, and then the top is 200 years of the local Fredericksburg history. And I realize that it's very difficult to see, but the very, very bottom right photo is the photo that I was referring to that has the people from the transgender clinic in it. Okay. And some of the, like, I'll just go into a couple of things up here just because they're interesting tidbits, although I realize you can't see them very well. But some of the things that are focused on within the local history. One is that there was a gay bar in Fredericksburg. It was actually outlawed in Virginia by the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, et cetera, that you couldn't serve alcohol to gay people, and that was passed in the 1930s. And it was lifted in actually 1990, so like super late, by somebody who sued them in Alexandria, Virginia. And so 1993, you have a bar here that was called Merriman's that opens. And when you read the reports of it, like the people reviewing the food, they'll say, well, the food's great, and you can't tell if they're being serious or like tongue in cheek, or if they really don't know, but they'll say, but there's constantly people going to the bar in the back of the restaurant that's a little bit interrupting, so that's funny. And there's another thing, there's this lovely image, which is, I realize, too small. Look at this actually is 5 feet wide if you're standing in front of it in person. But I found the image strictly because somebody had complained in a letter to the editor about seeing this picture of men kissing in the newspaper. And that's what led me to finding this other really great book that had been written by local women. So these are all just sort of testaments to this Fredericksburg always being a place where people, like queer people, were welcome, and sort of just like, you knew, but maybe you didn't say anything, maybe you did. So this is the timeline zoomed out, and it's set between, this is what I call the story section. So the quote that's on top says, "I wonder if I'm one of those things, how am I to find out?" And that's a quote that I pulled from a journal that was written in 1936 by a man named Keith Fitzer. And he was probably a sophomore in high school at the time. And he's writing and saying, like, just normal things. Like, he talks about how much he loves Les Mis, and he got to take the train up to DC and see Les Mis in person. And he's talking about like what he ate for dinner. And then at one point he says, I wonder if I'm one of those things. And he says that he read an article in Esquire magazine on homosexuality, and he has the symptoms. And his symptoms aren't even that he's attracted to men. His symptoms, quote unquote, are that he is grossed out when men talk like bodily about women, when they're like, you know, gross, like sexual about women. And he prefers the company of women. And so he says that line. And I just thought it was so moving, because there were so many people, especially like younger members of the queer population in Fredericksburg, because now it's not as, the culture has shifted after the closure of that gay bar, that will say, you know, had I known that there were all of these people that I could talk to sort of make sense of myself when I was younger, this would have made a huge difference in my life. To the left of the timeline in that quote, we have a phone booth that I built. It's a 1930s style phone booth, and in it there's a monitor, like a phone that you can pick up, and it starts recording, and you can either leave your own story, your oral history, or you can listen to somebody else's story. And the very first weekend that this exhibition was open, I had a really lovely story left that from a man that said he was from Northern Virginia, and he had fought himself and who he was for years and years, and ended up several times in like mental health institutions because of it. And that finally he decided to make peace with himself and love himself. And he said, I want you to know that I have a beautiful fiance, and I'm going to get married, and we're going to have children, and you're going to be okay. And that was just such a lovely story to hear. So sort of in the middle of all of this was designed by Emily Keppel, who if anybody ever needs a designer, like EDK Design out of Richmond, Virginia, absolutely amazing, amazing work. So you know how you can go to and type in, like, there's that website that you can see whose land you're on, what native land you're on. So there was a PBS version of a third gender map that Emily found, and they said, you know, could we use this? So I reached out to PBS, and they said, you can't use this, but you can make your own. And Emily said, that's fine, because I didn't like theirs anyway. So they went in, and the things that Emily didn't like about it was that they were sort of crass when they would discuss the third genders. You could tell that probably who put it together wasn't actually a member of the LGBTQ plus population. And also they completely omitted Africa, which is a huge oversight. So Emily actually designed this third gender map for the exhibition so that you can go in and you can read about the different genders all over the world. Here is a zoomed out section where you can really see that 7-foot installation of the web wall with gender across time, culture, and in nature. This is an interactive element, so there's like little doors you can pull up on. One of my favorite ones says, on the top of it says, who's the man in the relationship? And you open the door, and it just says, yikes. These are questions that you wouldn't ask. So it sort of goes into pronouns, goes into etiquette a little bit. It's playful, but it's also quite lovely. And we also have a little library reading list. And then also we have a resource list for all the research that was done for this exhibition. There's another image of it. Here's a better image of the phone booth. So the third section that we're getting into is what we refer to as the family room. And behind, if you were looking at this behind you, which you can't see here, there's a quote on the fireplace of this room that says, history said they were best of friends. And Lindsay, she just got married, but Lindsay Crawford, who you can see, there's a picture of a blonde woman over the shoulder of this couple. That's Lindsay Crawford. She works for the James Monroe Museum, which is another museum that's local, and she was part of the steering committee. And when I came to her initially, she said, if we just have a wall that says history says that they were best of friends, that would be my favorite thing. So the family room is stories of like historical stories of people, but also contemporary stories. So the couple that's pictured here, we have Gaia Degbalola with her wife, Queenie. And Gay is locally an absolute powerhouse. She's in her early 80s. She's a blues musician. She was just inducted into Library of Congress this fall. I know because she had to borrow her shoes back from this exhibition, which are featured there. That's the outfits that she and Queen were wearing when they got married. She's a huge civil rights leader in the area. She's just really wonderful. And so she actually, in addition to loaning some of her music to be played in this exhibition, they loaned their outfits. The sideboard on the left, we'll get into that a little bit later, but that sideboard was actually in this same room for 30 years before this exhibition, which also that's really thrilling to be able to turn over an exhibition that's been someplace for 30 years. That's of like silver spoons and decorative furniture to put something, you know, meaningful like this in that space. But the sideboard was actually there because it belonged to a man that was the museum's or the town's mayor at one point, but it got to stay because his daughter was actually her diary's in here. We'll get into her a little bit later. Okay, so here, the man in the red shirt is the older version of Keith Fitzer. Keith is the man that I told you about whose journal we got the "How would I know?" Well, I wonder if I'm one of those things. How would I know? Quote. And the man that he's sitting here with in the leopard print is Eddie Johnson. And Keith and Eddie met when they were serving in the Army, World War II. They were both artists. Keith actually did a bunch of murals for the Red Cross in Iceland and Italy and all over the place. We don't know quite as much about Eddie, but they came back to Fredericksburg and they lived in a store that was, it doesn't really mean anything if you're not here, but Fielding Lewis, which was I can't even remember. I'm very niche in my history, but it's a revolutionary style house that they lived in forever. But they were both artists. And this painting on the left-hand side is something that was in the museum's collection. And this painting is known as Dirty Eddie. And the story goes that they absolutely adored each other. They were never seen without each other, but that they would get in these huge fights because they basically subsisted off of sherry and snack cakes. Eddie would leave, he would go get thrown in jail, and Keith would have to go bail him out, and then it just sort of would repeat. So I think he looks like Wesley from The Princess Bride. I think it's a very smoldering look for him, but it's fun to be able to have this piece in that exhibition. Here is the diary of Jane Johnston. So when I mentioned the sideboard that got to stay, it's because it would have been in her house. So this is a diary that was actually in the museum's collection, and this exhibition had about a 2-year lead time for research. And so when I was doing inventory, I was paying attention to the content of handwritten records. And I started reading her journal and I realized that there was something here. So she's frequently talking about her dear friend, Anne. And sometimes it gets a little bit salacious. And then there's sometimes poetry that she's writing, and there's lots of talk about like in your bosom rising and falling and those sorts of things. And it's important to note that we wouldn't give a label to somebody who lived a couple hundred years ago, because sexuality was viewed differently then. It was viewed as a more fluid thing, and it was very common to have relationships with people that were the same sex that were very physical and sometimes intimate, and it just wasn't viewed the same way then. So she talks about her friend Anne in this journal. And then at one point, her brother comes in and admonishes her and says, you have to break your relationship with this person, no matter how much it hurts you. And so it appears that she does, because she then, like, there's a page for the family Bible that then basically writes her back into the family and says that she has come back to Christ. So her behavior after that, you could tell it was, she actually lived for another 40 years after she stopped writing in this journal, but you could tell that she felt something had been taken from her and she really was going to live her life on her own terms. And so then she starts doing things like emancipating people that were enslaved that had been given to her, and just really making sort of big steps on her, like, this is my life. This, you know, you might take this from me, but other things are on my own terms. So here we get into the epidemic. So this is a version of the AIDS quilt that was started by a man. There's a university here called University of Mary Washington, but it used to be Mary Washington College, and it's a liberal arts university. And in the early 90s, there was people that were working at the university that started, they had AIDS, but you wouldn't tell people that you had it. And so one of them started this quilt project, and it was something where you could, instead of like the names quilt where it's specifically for a certain person, sometimes these are people that are making a little square just as a way of like connecting with others. And this is a thing that the students are doing together. So it starts in the center, and it's actually really, if you read it, it's just tear jerking. There's lots of I'll miss you, Mom, and, you know, or names of people. And as you go out, it becomes more recent. And on the far left, there's actually a square that talks about a woman named Beatrice, and she actually was the first student at the university to be out about having the virus. And this was in the early 2000s, and she actually has a baby, and the baby doesn't have AIDS, and she's, you know, probably in her 30s or 40s now. Some other things that are in this section, we have the World AIDS Day bell, and then the, not a great picture of it, but the plot from the Master Gardener's garden that was at the FAHAS, which is the Fredericksburg Area Health and Support Services, which was essentially started so that people who had AIDS and or HIV could have a place to sort of go and get their affairs together, because, you know, it was a terminal disease at that point. And the thing I love about that Master Gardener's plan is now, instead of it being a memorial space as much, it's more of a like they hold barbecues there, and that's really quite lovely. So from this section, we move into drag. So the first person to refer to themselves as a drag queen was William Dorothy Swan. And he was actually born in 1860, enslaved. And by the 1880s, there's records of him throwing these huge parties in Washington, D.C., and which were highly publicized and also very attended by the police. And you can read records of him having the police come in and shut one of his parties down and roughhousing, like manhandling him, and him saying, "You ain't no gentleman." And really an interesting figure. So in this case, we have on the back, I think there's a better picture of it. Yeah. So we have what Shenandoah refers to as screenshots, which are the makeup wipes that she and her team will use to take the makeup off at the end of the night. But then we also have some things about drag kings, which there's a drag king who went by the moniker Jack Twist before he transitioned. He's actually now a trans man. And so he actually would dress up as Edward Scissorhands and shuffle around to Someone to Love Me, which is really funny. So we have some of his things, including a vial of testosterone from when he started to transition. So here we have a picture of Shenandoah in her performance. So, and then we saw this picture earlier of the little screen grab from the movie that was playing. So Shenandoah, her mother is from Louisiana and her father is Cambodian. And so to hear her tell it, she says that she has never felt, especially as with that heritage and also as a trans woman, she hasn't ever really felt like there's a place that she really belongs. And although if you meet her, you'd know that she belongs anywhere. She's absolutely fabulous. But she says that the instance where she does feel it makes sense is like when you visit the Shenandoah Valley and it's fall, and that brief moment when the leaves start to change and everything is just bright and vivid and orange, she feels like that's where she makes sense. So that's why she goes by the name Shenandoah. And she actually has this project called Yellow Peril, which she performs honestly all over the place, which is about a woman who is fighting to save dance. And of course, the Yellow Peril refers to her Asian American Pacific Islander heritage. So when we were in the living room before, we can say out of the closet, but still in the house. As you circle around this exhibition, and I think we moved past the places where we had resources. Then once you get to the end, you're out of the closet and out of the house. And so this is an area that I finished so that it looked like an independent bookstore, like a queer bookstore. And so we have and Shenandoah actually helped with this exhibition. So she was like, you have to get this pattern brick. And so we have posters here that are for some of the events. There was actually a couple of years of programming that I scheduled for this exhibition, monthly programming. I had been holding mixers every month leading up to this exhibition as part of having people help contribute their stories. So we have musicians, we have this flyer on the right-hand side, which is an improv workshop that was held by my dear friend Quinn Fontaine, who is a trans man, and also does like a really great, actually international improv workshop that's free called Play Together Planet. And it's not improv like slapstick, it's improv like playing and getting in touch with sort of your deeper self. So we have these posters for the upcoming events that are presented alongside of some historical posters of different local musicians playing. And then some, like this is a mixer that Erin McEwen, who actually somebody might know who Erin McEwen is. She's really talented. She's out of Massachusetts now. So we have some of those like ephemera, but then we also have sort of a sample station like they used to have in CD shops where you can sit down and you can put on headphones and you can go through Spotify of about 25 different albums of queer musicians from this region and listen to them. And here's just a close-up of some of the other performers. So we have Tristan James on the left, who is a musician. Jasmine Christine Ford, who actually just, her talk was postponed, but she just held it. She just released her second book called The Struggle of Being Trans, Black and Trans. And Jasmine's story is really interesting. She came here from Florida. She was a sex worker and a nurse, and she was having a hard time keeping up with both. And she came to Fredericksburg, and she was just blown away because she was working at FAHAS, which was the AIDS, the service that we were talking about earlier. And she said that she was blown away because somebody had put down like some money for her to have like her first month's rent covered while she got her feet under her. And she says, I was a really good nurse, but I wasn't a good employee. And Joseph Little, who was the president of FAHAS, came to her and said, look, I could absolutely fire you, but I believe in you. And so she got herself together and ended up being a really talented nurse. And she's actually the commissioner for HIV for the DMV. But she said that Fredericksburg was the first place that she really felt that she was seen and valued outside of her sexuality. And then on the right-hand side, we have Erin McEwen, who is the amazing instrumentalist from Fredericksburg, but also lives in Massachusetts now. She actually had a play off Broadway that was about immigration called Miss You Like Hell. And this is actually Erin McEwen when she was young, playing at a coffee shop that's just kitty cornered from the museum. And the article that's adjacent to it that says cleaning up their act is actually, this is a 90s article. Actually, the woman that was in let's see if I can get back to her. That's actually Ms. Gay Adegbalola in the 1990s. And it says cleaning up their act, which they didn't, but great musicians. All right, so I think that's the end of my presentation. This is a lovely photo of, so this is resource reading and reflection, which is, there's a section that you can sit on it. And I just before I go, I want to talk a little bit about the windows and this cityscape. Looks like I didn't. So there's a huge text wrap that is very Barbara Kruger-ish that wraps up this wall and then the blue wall that we see there, and then up over the bulkhead of the space that has quotes from some of the songs that are presented in the exhibition. There's a couple of Bible verses in there, And then there's also quotes from a post-it project that the Pride Center had. Oh, and I also want to say, so this skyline that's down here on the right-hand side is queer buildings. So as in like either queer-owned business currently, or there's like a plantation that's there because Walt Whitman visited it during the Civil War and said that there was, piles of limbs here and there. And Leaves of Grass is actually one of the books that I have that you can read in the exhibition. I love then The Color Purple as well. And then this top picture, you can see Shenandoah here the night of the opening. Her screenshots, as I said, are back there behind her in the case. But the windows of this space, we had this issue when I was at the museum. Like I said, I'm no longer there, where it's a federal building that was built in the 1800s. And so people don't think that it's a place that they can go into. It's not very welcoming. And so I put these pictures in the windows so that people would be able to see them and think like, oh, there's something interesting in there. And it's pictures of lots of different figures that we've gone over today. And this amazing thing happened that I wish I could say I planned, but I didn't, where in the morning from the east side, you get rainbows that come in and travel across the floor on the east windows. And then in the evenings, about 5 o'clock, you get on the west side, you get these rainbows that come in through those windows and travel across the exhibition and the floor. And it's just quite lovely. And that is what I have.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I loved getting to hear about this exhibition. I guess we'll open it up to questions from the group. If you would raise your hand to be called on, or use the hand raise reaction. Noreen, go ahead, unmute yourself and take it away.
Thank you for, that was a fabulous overview of history, and having been queer for a very long time, I'll just say that way, from Los Angeles to New York. I know a lot of history from, I know things from the Queer Caucus, but what I'm interested in is the South is a major intersection right now for all actions about our future. I think our future as a country. And so I'm just curious about, I keep thinking like, I was part of the AIDS generation.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was 28 years old, sex is death. It was terrifying. I remember one night having drinks with a lover friend of mine, Adrian, in San Francisco, and we talked about how many people we buried that year. It was a plague. You cannot, people now, I can't imagine just, how scary it was, and just how many people died, and died horrible, painful deaths. Families came in and swept out apartments, belongings, all the stuff. So that I'm just saying, having lived through that, those tools like ACT UP work then, but this is a very different time. So I keep talking to people as activists is that we need new tools. I feel some of the crowd is looking for a spectacle. So if we show up in a mass march, I think they'll shoot. Like the Proud Boys, I think they're looking for spectacle. So anyway, that's just been my private thoughts. So I'm very appreciative of your perspective. I'm very, very appreciative that you took the time to do this. And do you have any thoughts about 2025?
So a story that I want to tell really quickly before getting into that, as you're mentioning with spectacle. So because I'm from Wyoming, and I was like 2 years behind Matthew Shepard in that same town that he graduated from, right? I was, I think, a senior when he was murdered. And here in Fredericksburg, there was, they did the Laramie Project play pretty rapidly after he was murdered. I think it was like the early 2000s. And Westboro Baptist Church came out. And the entire, this actually kind of gives me chills. And the city was mad. And you had police, like, to hear the people that were there at the time, they had, this I know isn't, again, isn't exactly what you're talking about, but there was people that were stopping people saying, you know, I don't care what you're up to, what you boys are up to, but you're Fredericksburg boys, and we're not going to let people mess with you. And so there was actually, you can read a newspaper article that says that there were 200 people that turned out with candles when Westboro showed up to make a spectacle, and they just turned their back to him, and they had the kids go into their play, and just, which is just like such a powerful thing. Yeah. So I think, you know, I was, as you're talking about 2025, I was absolutely shocked to find out politically what things might be, you know, what the future might hold, as I think were most of my friends. I will say that I haven't heard, and I still have a friend at the museum, I haven't heard any rumblings of anybody protesting this exhibition. It's there was one person that stole the pride flag that I had outside, you know, but aside of that, all of the feedback has just been, wow, I haven't been able to be a place and see myself like this before, which is pretty incredible.
Right. Good for you. Yeah.
Thank you for your question, Noreen. Sarah S., your hand is up next. Oh, you are muted, Sarah.
Sorry. Thank you. I got it. I have a couple questions. One is that in drag and transgender are not the same thing.
Correct.
Right. There's a long, long history of heterosexual men doing drag. Shakespeare's time.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, in the research you did, how you differentiated what was drag just for the sake of dressing up, and what was more, well, we used to use the word transvestite. I don't think that's used anymore, but more of a transgender statement.
So I will say that the only person that I know who is trans that does drag is Shenandoah. But I know a lot of people who are not trans that also do drag. So I think that if it was confusing that I used her as the example, that was
That's not what I was asking. I was asking, like, in the balls in the Civil War. So they dressed up as men, but were you able to discern whether this was because their sexuality was different, or was it just that men were around, so they dressed up as men?
So from the first,
I mean, as women.
From the letters that I read, and you know, there's a book, one of the books two books, one was The Vacant Chair, and then another one was called What the Soldiers Wouldn't Say, which is about sex during the Civil War.
Right.
And it's hard to, you know, similarly to how we wouldn't slap a label on somebody from a couple hundred years ago. It's hard to know what they were feeling. But there's one instance where they're talking about how a man came into the room, and there was a man that was dressed as a woman, and he said, "Do you like what you see?" and held up his gown and exposed himself. And then the two spend the night together. So I think in my research, there's this sort of like fluidity to sexuality sometimes when you put a lot of people, like if you don't have the gender that somebody would usually be attracted to, that can sort of shift. So I think that probably with those gander balls, it was a little bit of both, a little bit of somebody missing a female touch and being like, wow, I would love to see somebody in a dress. And then also I think that there was that malleability of sexuality for some of the others.
Okay. And then the other thing, I was, you had the maps in there around the world, but it's really difficult to see.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a Asiatic Indian friend whose firstborn is transitioning to a male, and I was reading about transgender in South Asian culture, and that in 2014, the Indian Supreme Court recognized, it's called Hiras or Hirjas, I'm not sure. And so I'm wondering if that's because it looked from the map, but some of the parts of the world were covered up, that there's a fair amount of that in
An incredible amount. And even in like in Judaism, there's, I think, the minimum like of 5 recognized genders.
Right.
So it's really much more prevalent than than people, things have been, and I don't like cleaned up so much from what the actual reality is as far as what things are presented through a colonial lens. There's a really interesting book called The Space Between Us, which is specifically about, Noreen, you're nodding, maybe you've read it.
No, 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 I'm just
It's fascinating, but
with what you're talking about. That's all.
it's specifically about like colonialism and sort of othering of anything except for like white heteronormativity.
Yeah. I was going, I'll just lower my hand here. The thing I was going to talk about was Bernadette Bruton was somebody who served on my MFA committee, and she's an ancient religious scholar.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Bruton's many things, but she spoke 7 ancient languages and did all of this research. She wrote the book on first century rabbis, which really was a breakthrough at the time because no one had ever considered that in Judaism. But the other part of it is she talked about the ancient world, and it was really a relationship of power. And I think it's directly relevant to how we view sex today, in that for the Romans or in the Greeks, if a man was the aggressor, so he could have a child, he could have a boy, he could have a woman, it was all the same thing. But it was the idea that you don't be passive, that it was aggressive and passive roles. And it's about the power dynamic. And fast forward to the discovery doctrine by the Catholic Church, which unleashed in the 15th, 16th century, blessed colonialism, and in its worst forms, that they would force people to convert under the sword. But in addition to that, they were forcing them into that narrative we have at Christmas of Mary and Joseph, and very defined roles for the Virgin Mother that had to do not only with sexuality, but where sex was appropriate. So I'll just leave it there. I mean, you can all talk among yourselves, but I think it's very much about a power dynamic.
So in the research specifically about gender, the history of gender, because I think I read 3 different sources on that. And it really is like, it makes you so mad because it's essentially like in lots of cultures, like women hold the power, and then something slips, and then the patriarchy is able to take over, and then that's the whole reason that you're right. It's just so that men can remain in power. And like Genghis Khan. No, there was one of the invaders. He actually would had all of his daughters running things because he realized that they were so much more efficient at running his sort of, I'm trying to think of what they're called, crusades. And then when he died, then his son came in and killed all the daughters. And so it's, just instances like that for centuries and centuries and centuries. And you also have things like, you can go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and these like really ancient testimonials. And when you read them, they're very very gay, but people then somehow you pretend that things are metaphors eventually. So it's very interesting. Did I miss a question from anybody?
Oh, not that I can see. This has been a really great discussion. It's been wonderful to hear these different perspectives. Sarah, you have another question.
Yes, I have another question, which was, it was Burdash that believed, no, wait a minute. I wrote it in the chat. Did that only refer to trans women? Or,
Well, it was beyond that. So it was like two spirit, or like they're
Yeah.
called two spirits, but then there might have actually even been more than the three genders. I didn't see any instances where it was documented where women were transing as men in the discussion of the Burdash. So that's something that I would have to read about more.
yeah, well, and I've actually done a little bit of research into that, because my work, a recent group of work that I did was political portraits of people who were the first in their cohort to be elected to various governmental positions. And I think one of the most famous ones right now is Sarah McBride.
Mhm.
But I had the list of all these trans women, and I really had to dig to find a trans man, and I did, and which raised a couple, like a sociological question, but also just a logistical question, which is that there's in the United States, there's 3 times more trans women than trans men.
Mm.
And then the whole other issue is that so often the bathroom bills and stuff, and even when the AIDS crisis first came up, and not surprisingly, that women are ignored. I had a trans friend when I lived in Oregon. I mean, an acquaintance, and I knew him for 8 years before I knew he was a trans man. I would have never wanted him to walk into the women's room,
Mm-hmm.
but that is totally ignored.
There's a really, really great book by a woman named Jen Mannion, who is out of somewhere in Massachusetts. She actually came and did a presentation on this. And the book is called Female Husbands.
Uh-huh.
And it starts in the 1600s in Europe. And then it's sort of has the trajectory where people come over. And I think there's documentation of in Syracuse, but it speaks a lot about women who transed as men.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating.
And how did you get, like, aside from that Fredericksburg has a large LGBTQ population, how did you personally get interested in this?
I'm an ally and an advocate, and also the A on that LGBTQIA spectrum. And I also just am really interested in making sure that everybody is heard. So for me, with the museum's mission statement saying that we collect, et cetera, everyone's story, to me, that means everyone. And so I have lots of friends that I could access and sort of just start this project, and ended up with so many wonderful friends.
Right.
That's how I was interested in it. Yeah. And two of my kids are also bi. So it's just, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for answering all my questions.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to follow up with one thought too for you, is that if you actually read the church transcripts of Joan the Arc, they're fascinating.
Mm.
The things she was burned to death at, and burning someone to death was a painful way to go. They did it because she cross-dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And that this happened with the Nazis also when they were having discussion. I won't go into it, but I did a lot of research on queers in Nazi Germany. And what happened was that men could never decide about women and their emotions. Women are so close to other women, period, and they're affectionate. They couldn't sparse out where the dividing line is. So paragraph 175 and so on and so forth was usually about men and who they penetrated. So again, it goes back to that power thing. And I think even today, I think there's a really, really important role for feminism, because when we look at the far right and how they situate women, what they're really mad about is trans women somehow are deserting the cause, I think. I mean, there's something in this that's about power and an affront to them. You know, it's interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I don't,
So my thoughts on the idea of trans women having power.
Yeah, and also how the opposition reacts. What I'm interested in is what creates bigotry.
Oh my gosh. So I
What's the
thought
source of that? Yeah.
until I was probably 43 that if you just get the right information in front of somebody,
Right.
that they're gonna be a decent person, right? And I've thought that about, race issues and gender issues. And what I have found is that the people that that push back on what I would consider like my values, or sort of like they're so terrified of losing their position with that they just cling to those beliefs. And I can give you a different example of that. When I was in the museum, so there was an auction block that had been still on the streets that was used to sell people that were enslaved back in the day. And it was there. The city had argued, like, do we keep it? Do we get rid of it? What do we do? And then 2020 happened, and they finally pulled it, and they brought it to the museum to be interpreted. And so it was, there was a long process with this organization that canvassed the city to see what should be done with it. But so it was brought to the museum, and they hired a curator for African American history and special projects to interpret it. And so she had this huge space, but there would be, and I'm thinking of this one guy in particular who would come in and he would say, "I'm here to visit an old friend," which just, oh my gosh, like skin crawling, right? And at one point, there was a man that was a member that I could see them on, because it was in the first floor of the museum. I could see them arguing, and I went downstairs, and the member was actually somebody who had been on the steering committee for that exhibition. So he was a professional mediator. And so he was asking him this question and that question. And the guy basically just flat out said, "Well, I don't want to have to read any of this." So he, all of this huge, well thought out exhibition. And he was so determined to just be mad because that was what he aligned with, that there's nothing, like, he wasn't even interested in reading any of the other things. And so I think that's, and the sort of like, people have something that I don't have. Like, what if you could just paint your, like, be a man and paint your fingernails and sleep with whoever you wanted, and you didn't do that, and now you're angry because you drive a truck because you think you have to. And I think that's a big source of it too.
I've just put a link in the chat. So I linked to Female Husband by Jen Mannion. And I've also linked to a book called Us and Them by David Barabee. And it really goes into this question of identity and what causes these divisions that, Noreen, you might be interested in looking into. It's quite a good book.
Yeah, and I actually, I can send out, I don't know how, but I can send out the link to the research and reading list that I used for this exhibition if anybody's interested in those documents.
Oh, please, Sarah, that sounds incredible.
Amanda, if
You put it in a PDF if you can, and then just send it out. It's there. Okay.
yeah, Amanda, would you be able to help me get that out to everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. After we're finished here, we can compile something and make sure that all of the attendees receive that.
Great.
Did you include Kate Bornstein's book, Gender Outlaw?
I haven't read that one. Gender Outlaw.
I mean, I used to be a friend of hers, so I mean, this book is really fun to read, and she goes really like through her whole history as well. And then she did like following up with a book called My Gender Workbook. So where, like people defining how they see themselves as gay or as queer, as like, how do you identify your own self, in that spectrum of sexuality. It's really interesting to read. So yeah, Kate Bornstein.
That is really interesting. Yeah, this book helped me understand things because like I had dated on both sides, but always ended up just absolutely hating people. And when I got to the part where I understood like what asexuality was, I was like, oh, and all of a sudden every relationship that I'd ever been in made so much sense. And so I think that having those books where people can make sense of themselves, things that you might have never crossed your mind are just such an incredibly valuable thing. And it's just tragic that someone wouldn't actually be able to have those resources.
Yeah, I have a niece that I wonder about her sexuality, and I'm wondering, she's 16, if I should send her my gender workbook.
That's fun. Yeah, there's a really great book called Non-Binary for Beginners that is super digestible. It's by a person named Ocean Atlas. It's a great read, great quick read. Thank you for these resources, Amanda.
Oh, thank you for hosting this talk. It's really been phenomenal. I love the discussion that's going on. I have one question for you before we wrap everything up.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what it was like to work with so many different generations of queer people in pulling this exhibition together. What's your biggest takeaway from being, working closely with all of these different perspectives?
So incredible. There's not a version of being queer, because you have so many different cultures and ages and all of those things that people are exposed to. So some of the people that I've met, like there's a man named Gary that's on a no-fly list that was in the Navy, and I'll say, what did you do? And he'll say, well, what I'm supposed to tell you is that I was because he was a deep sea diver. What I was supposed to tell you is that I was capping lines on the bottom of the ocean floor. What I was actually doing, and it's some sort of Russian espionage. That's why he's on a no-fly list now. And the stories that he would tell me get salacious here and there, but everybody has just been so transparent and forthcoming. But there's a man named Cedric Rucker who is the dean of the university here for the longest time. And he used to teach a class on gender when he was at the university. And he also was one of the people that helped start both Fajas and that AIDS quilt. And he came in to walk, and I walked him through sort of my thoughts. And he said, what you're doing, your exhibition is very tidy. And this experience is not tidy. And I said, he's the one that brought up the whole intersectionality of race, class, and gender, and the sort of the pecking order. And I would say, like, how would I address this? He's like, I don't think that you possibly can address this. You just mention it, because it's so. And he also would talk about the AIDS crisis and just like huge groups of people that would be just there and then not there. And then you would have some people that I met like through the food co-op here that wanted me to do a talk for them. And they had sort of a feeling of like, well, we don't have to worry about these things anymore. People are out, in this community. And so Then you have the younger generation, which specifically Shenandoah. So there's a piece of ephemera called the $3 bill, which was a program from the early 2000s when they had the first iteration of Pride. And when I showed it to Shenandoah, her mind was blown. She was like, how was there these things that were so accessible 20 some years ago, and now they're not as visible? And so really it was a huge difference between the people that grew up and were able to attend that gay bar when it was here. And then after the man died and it was shut down, then people don't see as much like a visible space that you can go in the community beside of the Pride Center, which has just been open for a few years. So that, and also like the intersectionality of those groups is like, it's so important to have this information out there, because they need, like, sometimes like the younger generation now doesn't necessarily know how to find the older generation as much.
Sarah, go ahead, jump in.
I just want to check something. I heard you say the early 2000s, the first iteration of Pride. Did I hear that right?
Yeah. So there's a Fredericksburg Pride.
Okay, maybe the first iteration of Fredericksburg Pride.
Yes, I'm sorry. A Fredericksburg Pride. Yeah, no, it was because there was a Fredericksburg Pride that was started in the early 2000s, and then it went on hiatus, I want to say like 2008.
Mm.
And then it has probably been back for about 5 years. But so you have like all of these people that are in their early 20s now that growing up, they never actually even saw like the parades and these sorts of things. So yeah, definitely not the first iteration of Pride, like for the country. No.
I was going to say, because the Washington, D.C. is having its 50th anniversary.
I think Stonewall was in 69.
Yes.
Was it? Yeah.
And just to brag or show my age, I was at the first Washington, D.C. Gay
Wow.
Pride half block party.
Wow.
Yeah, 1975. Yeah.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up and head out for the day? Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing this with us. I hope that this continues. I don't know if you have plans to move it around to any other locations, but I know it's something that's very much needed in the community, and it was really wonderful to hear these stories.
Absolutely. I actually was I was laid off about 2 weeks after June ended unexpectedly from the museum. So I still have projects that are trailing that I'm actually going to like oral history projects and those sorts of things that I'm going to use the Department of Historic Resources here in Virginia to record, because they actually have a really great like 52-page document of queer history in the United States about the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. So it's not going anywhere. That's
wonderful. We're very glad to hear that. All right. Well, thank everyone here for attending and participating. Please be sure to come back next month for our next second Saturday session in January. And happy holidays, everyone. No matter what you celebrate, please be warm and cozy and enjoy a relaxing new year.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Bye.